We're ready to begin if everyone else is ready. My name's Jim Connolly. I've met most of you, but for those of you who haven't, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. We're very appreciative of having people here from so many corners of the world, and they've all arrived at this very early hour to begin things. I have a few things to say in the way of housekeeping, but before I do that, I want to introduce Terry King, Provost of Ball State University, and he's been kind enough to come over and offer a brief welcome before we begin. So, Terry.
Well, thank you, Jim, and good morning. As Jim said, I'm Terry King. I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Ball State University. This is one of the fun things I get to do during the week here at the university. I want to begin by thanking the conference organizers, Jim, of course, Jim Connolly, John Straw, James Bradley, and Melanie Kabak. Organizing any conference is no small feat. Organizing a conference in late winter in Indiana in a city without a major airport is a special challenge. I also want to thank the conference program committee, Pat Collier, Frank Felsenstein, Ken Hall, and Robert Hall, no relation, I think. They took extra duties between teaching classes, grading papers, and of course doing research. And I especially want to thank the conference sponsors. This event is funded by a collaborative research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Ball State's own Center for Middletown Studies. The university community is grateful for their support and for this opportunity. As I reviewed the program several weeks ago, I could not help but be impressed by the depth and breadth of scholarship and the miles some of you have traveled to participate. So thank you all for being here. We are honored by your presence and better for your participation. The irony of providing an oral welcome to a conference on print culture has not escaped me, but no one can escape the impact that print culture has had on our history or even on our future. So this is going to be a very interesting time. And before this session started, Jim was telling me a little bit more about what was going on here and some of the papers, and he indicated that I think you're presenting a paper on West Liberty, Iowa. Is that right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it does that. Well, I grew up near there, so perhaps I can come back for that presentation tomorrow. This should be very fascinating. Again, thank you all for participating, and I wish you to have a very good conference here. So,
thanks, Terry. All right, I have a few bits of housekeeping before we begin. I want to certainly add my thanks to the NEH, to the conference staff and organizers. Pat Collier here. I'm putting them out so you can ask them questions if you need anything. Rob Hall, Ken Hall in the back, and Frank Felsenstein here on the side. So we've all been working on putting this together, so I definitely want to thank them. I appreciate all their help. Most of you, I think, have met Melanie Kabak, who is downstairs at the registration desk at the moment. If you have questions, issues, you can also speak to her. She's actually put together a whole lot of this, as many of you already know. And so I want to thank her, even though she's not here. To hear that, I'll try to make sure I thank her again when she's present. There's a few other things I wanted you to know. One is that University Libraries was kind enough to stage an exhibit of material related to the What Middletown Read project over on the second floor in University Libraries. If you find yourself on campus and with time on your hands, I would recommend a short trip over there to take a look for a few minutes. There are other things to do on campus, so if you have any questions or you're looking for things to do, there's a list of restaurants in the folder we handed out today. You can also talk to any of us, and we'll be glad to give you our recommendations as well as suggestions about where to avoid. In terms of housekeeping, I think I've mentioned to everyone who's come here by email, but I want to reiterate, save your receipts. For us to reimburse you, we have to reimburse original receipts. If you have an email from an airline for your reservation, that's a sufficient receipt. You don't have to have something a little more official than that. But you need to get the originals to us in order for us to reimburse you. You should also have provided your name and address when you registered. We'll need that as well as part of the reimbursement process. As you can see, we're videotaping the proceedings. So a few things to keep in mind. All of you, I think, have filled out permission forms this morning on your way in. If you have not, would you please remember to do so? We'll need that in order for us to make this video available publicly. And that's one of the things we agreed to do as part of the proposal we gave to the NEH. So we asked that you give your permission. I'm assuming everyone's okay with it since we sent you the permission forms in advance. But if there's anyone has any questions about it or any problems, just see me. You see the microphones here, or the microphone and others are hooked up. When you're presenting, I would appreciate it if you'd come up a couple minutes early so we could get you mic'd up. If you have PowerPoints or other material you want to put up on display, then please come a little bit early and we'll set you up. The microphones are only for the recording. They're not projecting into the room, so if it seems like they're not on, they are. So you don't need to tap it and say, is this thing on? It is. We're over here in this great spot, but we're aware as well that we're a bit away from the campus and so forth. So I don't want anyone to feel like they're imprisoned here. Some of you I know are operating on much different time zones than ours. So if you need to escape for a little bit, you can speak to me, you can speak to Melanie. Mike Smith in the far back can also give you a ride back over to the hotel if you need it. So just let us know. We're happy to shuttle you to and fro. We do have plans to publish the papers that we've collected in this conference. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but I certainly would be interested in hearing your ideas about that as well over the course of the day. As far as the format for the session, since we've pre-circulated the papers, what we're asking for is something a little bit different from the ordinary session. Instead of reading a paper, as we've discussed, I'd like each of the presenters to give a short overview of their paper on the assumption that everybody has read or at least skimmed the papers. We'll just leave it at that for the moment. And then the commenter will have a little bit more time, up to about 20 minutes, to elaborate on some of the themes developed in each of the two papers, and that should leave ample time for group discussion for each session. We are a little bit behind schedule, but not too badly. But the other thing I'll tell you is I'm the one who makes the trains run on time. So I'll try to keep the sessions about on schedule. We have pretty good sized breaks in between each session, about a half an hour in most cases, an hour or more for lunch. So we have a little bit of flexibility in that way, but we'll try to keep it pretty much to the schedule you see in your program. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve, who can introduce our first panelists, and we can begin. So.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Terry.
The introduction part of this job is a surprise to me, but I will assume that having read the papers, I'll have you, the panelists, introduce themselves. Our first paper is by James Raven.
Hello. Do I need to introduce myself? I'll just say hello, and how very pleased I am to be here. James Raven, University of Cambridge, University of Essex, and we're operating slightly on a different time zone, so forgive me, but that might slow me down and not speak so quickly. So, yes, in the paper that I put together, really, it comes at an interesting time for me. I've just before leaving to come here, I mean, literally within hours, I delivered a huge typescript of the book of the Panizzi lectures that I gave 2 years ago at the British Library, which explore the sites of printing and publishing in London before 1800, between 1500 and 1800, with over 100 illustrations, 50 figures and 50 tables, and fingers crossed that the British Library will publish that, but I hope so. So I'm very interested in the question of site and production. But for nearly 30 years ago now, alas, I worked a lot on jobbing printing and provincial and regional printing. And that's coming together now at last via many other different projects in between, in 2 books, one for Manchester and one for Boydell and Brewer. The one for Manchester is due on the 20th of March. I'm not sure I'm going... What's the date today? I don't know whether I'm going so this comes as an interesting... So I'm going to combine those two things in terms of sites and jobbing printing. And what I intend to do now is just spend about 5 minutes making some points about my paper, and then 5 minutes running through some sources which might be quite useful for you to see in terms of visual evidence. One of the things that comes through as well before I make my main point is the difference between printing and bookselling. And I think those of you who may know my last big book, the Yale book, The Business of Books, which was a history of bookselling and printing and publishing in Britain from 1550 to 1850. I don't think I quite pointed sufficiently to the difference between booksellers, who were known as booksellers, publishing booksellers, who had presses and those who didn't have presses. It's there, but I think I really should have headlined that. So I want to make a bit more of the difference between the printing house and the book-selling establishment. And it's complicated, of course, by the nomenclature, you know, about the fact that people called themselves booksellers in the 17th and 18th century. And we've got to actually interrogate what bookseller actually meant, not just the difference between wholesale and retail, but whether it involved printing or not. Anyway, the main point, I mean, the main point that I'm making in the paper is a really simple one, two basic contentions. That you can't really understand the history of the printing house or of printing in Western Europe between the arrival of the printing press and through the 19th century without understanding the role of non-book printing, of jobbing printing, of small jobs, which we can describe as fractional sheet printing, or we can just think of it as jobbing work, of all the myriad of small forms of little documents that were printed that are not non-book printing. And I make the point in the paper that I believe they were absolutely fundamental, bread and butter of the print shop, in order to, particularly in the sort of ancien regime time of the printing press, when most printing presses in most cities worked at under capacity. They didn't fulfill demand in terms of book, and they needed that to tie over work. And the second point is that I think you can't really understand, a major issue, you can't really understand commercial and economic history of Western Europe without understanding a key role that's provided by the printer generally in providing those little bits of printed paper which enabled financial transactions, lowered transaction costs, a whole range of things. In fact, you could make it, for a further book which I'm calling Forms of Enlightenment, you can make a much larger claim about the nature of the form, of the printed form. And it brings up all sorts of very interesting ideas about the relationship between script and print, incidentally, because after all, the authority that's given to such a blank is the signature. So it reverses the normal thing about the authority and fixity of print, with interesting relationships between print and script as well. So that's the main claim that I'm making. Can I just bring out, I've scribbled down really sort of six further points. One, the first one really is that we probably have to be a little bit careful about what we mean by jobbing printing, and the terminology is difficult. When I give this sort of talk or across Europe, there's huge conversation that goes on in France or Italy about what their terminology is in French or Italian or Spanish indeed for the word jobbing or job printing. It's a complicated issue, I think. And we could make a distinction between jobbing and job work or small jobs. Do we define this non-book printing as in terms of fractional sheet production, you know, a strictly sort of bibliographical terminology in terms of something that is less than a sheet? If we do, then it includes ballads and small chapbooks and other things which would be small publications in a way. Do we want to think of it much more fractionally in terms of a small part of a sheet, in terms of a small indulgence or a small part of a print? Do we want to think of it more sociologically in terms of what the jobbing printing was actually for, rather than in terms of bibliographically? And finally, do we want to think of it in terms of survival and as ephemera as well, with a sort of time dimension? And as I say in the paper, there's also an aspect here about the huge non-survival rate of this material, which is really very, very interesting. Second point that I make more generally, apart from the definition of jobbing, is the issue of centralisation, different centralisation between different countries. And of course, although we're talking, and I changed my title to reflect the conference, although we're talking about, originally I concentrated a bit more on the urban, although we're talking about beyond the metropolis here, obviously a lot of the products originate in the metropolis, and they are found outside. So the boundary here between the metropolis and the province, or whatever you want to call it, the non-metropolis, is more complicated. It's not cut and dried. And distribution is an important part of what I'm saying. And indeed, the next point that I'd make in terms of distribution, and it's an important point generally, I think, in terms of the work on print culture and the history of the book, that we are, in terms of publication and book publication, talking about livres sans frontières, books cross boundaries. And that's been very important. It's an important critique of the growing number of the history of the book projects, which have tended to be, for good pragmatic reasons, nationally based. But that national boundary is a false boundary, because books cross boundaries. Now, if we're talking about non-book printing, then we're into a different sort of category, I think, in terms of distribution and which boundaries they actually cross, because in some senses the small jobs or whatever are more localized and more regional. And so in what I'm writing about in terms of non-book printing, I'm reviewing slightly that issue about boundaries, because there's also, of course, a category of non-book printing which is transnational, transoceanic. You could think of bills of lading, passports, printing for passports, which are fascinating sorts of materials, actually, transnational insurance policies and these sorts of things, printing for a transnational, shall we say, client, or a client that's dealing across boundaries and borders. So there's an interesting issue here about distribution distribution and crossing boundaries with non-book printing. Regulation, I talk a little bit about regulation and how regulation in terms of guild control might affect the difference between book printing and non-book printing. That's quite interesting, again, with the difference between the urban and the region. The issue, I think, also in terms of how... I'm very interested in limits to growth, that we don't actually think about a linear development in terms of printing history and print culture generally. There are checks and balances and constraints. And the transport bottlenecks, I think, are very interesting in terms of the distribution of material out there. So those are sort of some of the main points that I want to make in the paper. Now let's have a look if I can do something of sorts of some of the material and sources, which is a bit of a mélange, I think, but it might illustrate certain things. Both of the two projects, in terms of what I've just been finishing in terms of sites of production, which is very urban-based and London-based, but also in terms of the types of materials, sources that we might be able to have. One of the things about jobbing printing and small jobs is that, particularly evidentially, you have to do a lot of lateral thinking. As you'll see in the paper, the sorts of sources that one's using are coming from all over the place. And in terms of survival, it's often the client-based materials that you're looking at rather than production. There's so few business papers or anything relating to the printer or the print shop. So one has to think about who is ordering it in terms of local authorities or local clients or so forth to actually get the material. Oh, here's London, good map of London, and again, the point that I really want, this is going to really hurtle through this sort of things, but the centre of book production and printing in early modern London, very, very, very highly focused, but rather like, if you know London in terms of the modern railway stations, distribution points that are pointed around this central area, so that they're pushing the materials out to points east, west, north and south from particular coaching inns and so forth around the centre of the area. I'm interested in space as well in terms of this is one of the few surviving parts in London which looks a bit like it was in terms of the space for production. Let's move on. As I said, I'm sorry, this is going to be, this is just off Fleet Street. Let's just move through a little bit because I want to get onto the... One of the points which I'll come on to in a moment is also ethnicity, which is interesting in terms of not just the movement of materials, but the movement of immigrants in. So you've got provincial printers and so forth coming into London and then going out again. And in terms of the date lines here, in terms of regulation of the trade, again, it's not a linear development because, at least in the English case, after the Civil War, with the imposition of the licensing laws and printing acts, you have a restriction to the sites of printing, the imposition of that, which then breaks out again in the sort of the early 18th century. So, and here this is Cornhill, the centre of the financial printing. The point really being that a lot of the jobbing work, which is very effective in terms of lowering transaction costs and being useful in terms of commercial and financial development at the end of the 18th century, is London-based as well as produced in the centres. The destruction after the war, this is Paternoster Row, area around St Paul's Cathedral, which we just saw on the map in 1941, gives you a very graphic image as to why so many of the booksellers' records have not survived. I mean, that is Paternoster Row, the main production centre in the 18th century. Stationery records, fortunately, were escaped. The point that I made at the very beginning, the difference between printers and booksellers, when Mortimer tried to do his Universal Directory in 1763, he said some quite interesting things about how he found it very difficult to then define a bookseller and was interested in the way that they made their money, the difference between having a share in a literary property and their other sorts of enterprise. So it's not a new problem. I like this quote from Goff's magazine also about how many of the catalogues have been added to the Boghouse Miscellany, and miscellanies of equal utility, the extent to which, again, we've lost. Booksellers' trade cards are quite useful for getting some sense of their work, particularly with a sense of some of the non-book printing that they did, good clues to the further sorts of work from the printing house, and added to trade directories as well, which can be helpful, and some newspaper advertisements too. Lots of directories in the 18th century. The source that I've mostly been using, as some of you may know, are civic taxation records. These are the land tax records of London, and they give you a sense of the name of the occupier, evaluation of property, and so forth. Unfortunately, the tax collector moved on the same route every year. Here's Little Britain. Little Britain is a fascinating area of printing, particularly non-printing, rose to fame particularly, well, through the 17th century, but escaped the Fire of London. There's two great caesuras, there's two great breaks, really, the Fire of London and the Blitz in 1941, which sort of, and many booksellers and printers moved from Paternoster Row northwards to Little Britain, and then it declined through the 1750s. So you've got this sort of 70 years between about 1680 and 1750, roughly, when it's a great centre for non-book publication as well as book publication. And this just to give you an idea of why the civic taxation records are so useful, the ones that we just saw. We can reconstruct the route of the tax inspector and for the first time get a sense of exactly where the sites of printing and publishing were by bringing sources together, the civic taxation records, plus the trade directories, plus other fire insurance records and so forth. And I'm building a big digital model for this sort of thing, so that we're going to have a walk down Paternoster Row for the first time and go into the shops and see, because we've got all, after the fire court records, after the Great Fire, we've got records of the actual shapes and dimensions of the shops too. And I can just play with this. If there's a little taxman, I think we can watch him walk, can we? Oh, there he goes. And they're all different things, and you have to think of it as sort of 3D as well, because they're going up and down stairs, and there are things overlapping. But we're building on this, and this is what the Panizzi lectures were about. And this Fleet Street, which is 1,500 different properties, and you can see all the different tax routes here in different colours. We can probably do a little bit of playing. Well, there's one man going around there. I think we've got a yellow man coming down here, just to give you a sense of the stuff. But the point of this, the serious point of this, is it actually builds up a picture of the neighbourhood and the production. And we can get, have we got just a sense? Here we are. So we can get the snapshots of, here's the booksellers, here are the printers, and we can see the, got time to go into this, but we get a sense of the different sorts of profiles in different areas. And one of the points about this is the plasticity. This is around Paternoster Row, there's St Paul's, Paternoster Row, and so forth. I'll move through just to give you a sense. I think this will move through if I press it. Yes, it's moving, look, decadally. And it's showing you the different occupations. Red is bookbinders are quite interesting in this, and you'll see the bookbinders will start to develop here. That's sort of what geographers call, I think, conglomeration theory, the extent to which people start are attracted to one particular area. And that's also important in this area of... What one might also think of is industrialisation on a small scale as well, the development of larger printing plants through the 18th century, people like Strawn and so forth. I want to just come on, I'll skip ahead. This is just to show you non-fire. Let's just quickly go through. Why there were so many Scots. The important of immigrants. Here's John Murray, who had this wonderful quote. I think I've gone, there we are, if you can't read it. I should put that in white. It says, many blockheads in the trade are making fortunes, and did we not succeed as well as these, I think it must be imputed only to ourselves. Murray gave up his life at sea to look around for an opportunity in London to make money, and he first of all thought he'd go into the China trade, and then gave that up by went into the book trade. The point I'm making is that you don't actually, during the 18th century, you don't actually have to be skilled in book selling or go through the traditional routes to make money in the book industry. And this is where we're looking at the difference between the different crafts, between book selling and publishers and printers. There's Paternoster at the beginning. Here's two Scotsmen. There isn't, sorry, that's Richardson. Good Englishman on the side there. This is William Strawn, the great printer, who rose to be a great MP and prominent person. But the issue about where the Scots, I think will show you a map of where the Scots were, particularly associated around the Strand and so forth, and Fleet Street. I think what I'll try and do, what I want to do is, forgive me, flick through these, because I want to get to some sort of, that's just where the Scots were in the Strand. And there's an important aspect of this in terms of the networks, the support networks, not just the Scottish diaspora in terms of a client sort of groupage and so forth, but also the extent to which Scots help Scots. So you've got people like James McEwen who founds it. His is James McEwen's first shop at Buchanan's Head. He used the 16th century Buchanan as the head of his shop. And McEwen founds it. You've got Cadell, Miller, Murray, Strawn, all supporting themselves and producing works like this. But what I want to just quickly get on to, is the plasticity of the sites. Let me just rush through this, because I just want to show you very quickly some of the jobbing printing examples. Dr. Johnson's area. Let's quickly move on. It'll come up in a moment. Here we come. Cornhill. centre of, if you look at some of the prints are really very useful actually, because if you look at some of the detail of them, you get a sense of the sorts of print shops that you've got. This is nestling below the Royal Exchange in the centre of London. That's the same area, Cornhill and the Royal Exchange, the city. And we can do the same with these ones. Sorry, we are going to get there in a minute. That's the Royal Exchange. That's the Royal Exchange. I should have deleted these. Sorry, I tried to do this too quickly. Oh, another man. Sorry, going through. This is the Cornhill area where the bookshops are. Right. This goes really back to my earlier point about what is jobbing printing. You could say that this is this type here, which comes from a Cornhill bookseller, actually, bookshop, which is a small publication about money, could be seen as a job work because it's a one-sheet publication, like a sort of chapbook or so forth. But we have also got all these others. So here are bills of mortality. This is the sort of material that I'm thinking about in terms of being produced as non-book publication or non-book printing. These sorts of, here we are, we've got a Newcastle chit sold and delivered to. It's a receipt form, whole bundles of certificates, and you can see a cut from single sheets, an indenture, employment indentures, and again the relationship between script and print is really interesting. And it's been fascinating to me. I'm going to stop. I'm going to go over my time, but it's been fascinating to me looking often at archives where I've said, is that actually print or script? Sometimes the written is the script is so exacting and so very very like type. But it's a blank. It's a script blank. So it's a script. So scribe has worked it, but you've actually got to fill it in. That sort of material. And as I said, the survival rate of the business records of the people who produced it is very, very poor indeed. We know so little about their overall businesses. We can find out where they are around the country, and as I've got lots and lots of examples in the paper all across England of country towns and their work and the relationship between newspaper publication and jobbing printing. But what one really has to do is a bit of lateral thinking in terms of the clients. So I've scoured Britain and Ireland, some extraordinary stuff in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, of corporation records, town records, of who was actually ordering the stuff. And you then get a sense of how, you begin to get a sense of what the business profile of particular local printers look like. Okay, thank you.
Our second speaker is Kyle Roberts from the University of Chicago, and I'll let him introduce his talk.
Not sure what I need to. I don't want to show you the universe. I would love to be able to show you the universe.
You called up your...
Yeah, how do I get my web browser to show?
Oh, you want the web?
Yeah.
Is it...
So we just have to toggle it. I'm not sure. I'll start in while there. It's not absolutely integral to my presentation today. I'd actually just like to begin my comments with the opening anecdote from my paper, one that clearly I like so much that I used twice in the paper. In early 1722, Philip Doddridge, who was a student at a rural dissenting academy in the English Midlands, found himself in the unusual position of having a guinea to spend on books. I'm astounded by the number of people he consulted on what he should purchase with this windfall, and I think it really attests to the uncommonness of the opportunity before him. Over the course of several weeks, while this guinea is burning a hole in his pocket, he queried his benefactor, who was in fact a fellow classmate, his tutor, his former tutor, a recently graduated classmate, and even his sister about what he should buy. That guinea enabled him to participate in the marketplace, to acquire a desirable consumer good at a time when books remain scarce and expensive. But interestingly, Doddridge's dilemma was not so much in how to sort of participate in the commercial marketplace, but more in the sort of social ramifications of what his purchase might mean. What could this purchase do for his academic community, for his religious community, for his political community? I have hitherto been entirely upon the borrowing hand, he explained to his former tutor in a letter, and I should have been glad to have a book of such note as that I might, in my turn, oblige my fellow pupils with its perusal. For Doddridge, as I said, that guinea meant not simply a chance to consume, but the opportunity to participate in the rituals of sociability, built around books that structured the 18th century dissenting community. And this makes sense for Doddridge because he lives in a world where books are circulating primarily through social networks and institutions. What I love about this anecdote are several of the themes that I think pervade my paper, right? The scarcity of texts in general, but also, almost especially in rural communities beyond the metropole. But still that burning desire for access to texts, by all accounts, which is increasing over the 18th century in the English-speaking Atlantic. The wonderful range of strategies that people employ to get access to texts. And then finally that sense, that possession of a book, that ability to share for Doddridge in the early 18th century was less really about participation in a market economy and more about participation in social networks and institutions of dissent. Now this paper is the beginning of the first chapter of my second book. And this book really is going to look at the way in which dissenting academies around the Atlantic world are fostering literary communities which are also spiritual and political communities. It comes out of a project which will appear behind me at some point perhaps, that I worked on for 2 years in London between 2009 and 2011. And it's called Dissenting Academies Online Virtual Library System. And it was an absolutely wonderful opportunity to dive into the surviving catalogs and loan registers for the leading British Congregational, Baptist, and Presbyterian dissenting academies. The virtual library system, which I hope you'll all get a chance to visit, has 12,000 unique titles in it and loan information for over 40,000 transactions from the late 18th and into the 19th century. So within the system, we can look at the borrowing records of 600 students and tutors and members of the dissenting community. Part of Doddridge's library, part of what I'm talking about today, is already in that system. But not all of it is, and I'll be back in London this summer sort of filling out what's in there. Doddridge is important for those of you who are not sort of scholars of the 18th century dissent or 19th century evangelicalism, is important as an author. He gave us The Rise and Progress of Religion and the Soul, one of the most important devotional manuals of evangelicals in the 19th century. The Family Expositor, which was one of two of the most heavily borrowed texts from Harvard College in the 1760s and 70s. The Life of Colonel Gardner, one of these sort of great devotional sort of biographies. And he, in addition to this, in addition to being an author, he was a tutor, and he was an important minister. But before he was an important author, tutor, or minister, he was just a student at a rural academy. So the first part of my paper explores the place of books in an early 18th century rural dissenting academy. Dissenting academies are essentially educational institutions created in Great Britain following the Act of Uniformity in 1662. With the Act of Uniformity, dissenters were not technically excluded from the English universities, but a combination of legislation, the desire not to subscribe, and the customs and practices of the English universities themselves made those sites, made the English universities of Oxford and Cambridge not attractive sites for dissenters. So instead they created their own institutions. They highly valued a learned ministry. So these institutions began as a minister with some students in his parlor. By the mid-18th century, we get places like Warrington Academy. By the 19th century, we have Bristol Baptist and Manchester Academy. They become these sort of fully flushed out, robust institutions that have multiple tutors, purpose-built structures, and are really creating generations of dissenters. And part of the project is thinking about, well, what do they do? What is the site of the academy, and specifically the academy library, in shaping dissent and in sustaining dissent? So what we see, hopefully in Doddridge's experience as a student, and this comes from his voluminous correspondence, which has been preserved, is insight into the Academy curriculum, 1719 to 1722, a syllabus of the books that he's expected to possess, and his experience of a somewhat innovative pedagogical system. For each lecture, he was required to write down a significant number of references that he then had to go on and look up. The question, of course, becomes, where do you find those books? So it necessitates the beginnings of really substantial libraries. Then I move on to the wide range of strategies that Doddridge, the student, employed to acquire these texts. Purchases become really the least common option, and that's what makes that sort of opening anecdote so powerful. He doesn't really know what to do when he has this money. Loans are far more important, and with loans come social relations. Yes, and here is the virtual library system. Thank you very much. Should have not eaten so much bread and gotten up here earlier to get this straightened out. So my stomach thanks you. So loans become hugely important in his ability to access goods. Libraries, which, as I said, are documented within here. Public, private, academic. For any of you who've read David Allen's work, you know that libraries of the 18th century are increasing. And they're hugely integral to this sort of pedagogical system. But then also scribal publication, which is quite exciting to be in a conference where we see more about scribal publication. A really underappreciated aspect of dissenting print culture is the extent to which students like Doddridge had to produce their own texts. And then in the second half of the paper, I look at that shift from Doddridge the student into Doddridge the tutor. Doddridge, who had been dependent on others for the books that he needed when he was a student, now felt the necessity to provide books for his own students. And so when he opens his first academy in 1729 at Market Harborough, and then promptly moves to Northampton in 1730, again, places in the Midlands, Northampton's a market town, but it's not London by any stretch of the imagination, he has to work through how to provide books for his students. Wonderfully, there's a surviving catalog of books listing 104 titles, about 162 volumes from the Academy's first 3 years. Through those, as you see in my paper, I'm able to really sort of tease out what this world of giving, what this world of sort of reciprocity and generosity looks like within dissent. The source of his donation comes from ministers, largely in the Midlands, but also in London. Comes even more from laity, people in his own congregation, supporters across the English countryside, supporters in London, family members, tutors. So he's really pulling broadly. 61 donors giving 104 titles is actually quite impressive in a time when so many of these libraries begin as the sort of aggregation of 2 or 3 ministerial libraries. So we could talk a little bit about the contrast of what's so significantly different for Doddridge. Publication dates, right? 50%, the majority of these works, over 50%, were published in the half century before donation. A full quarter were published in the decade before they were donated. So these are new books that are coming in. People aren't just unloading old crappy books that they don't want to use anymore. 80% of the 18th century titles, of course, all come from London. They're all London imprints. But before that, far more continental titles are coming in, many of them Dutch, not at all surprising, given Dutch Protestantism and its influence on English dissent. Types of books, of course, reflect what Doddridge is teaching, but the books that aren't given are also instructive, right? That they're not giving classical texts, they're not giving geography, mathematics, or belles lettres, things which we know were taught in the academies, yet somehow are not things that Doddridge is asking or encouraging to be given. And then finally, the paper tries to move towards looking at an analysis of the 61 donors, and hopefully the appendix that I gave that sort of maps out where all these people live starts to reveal the importance of spatial distribution, the way in which the Midlands itself is supporting this dissenting institution, as well as the centrality of London. So, and I really like the point in one of the papers that's let's not think about the binaries of the metropolis and outside the metropolis, but the gray area, the fluidity. I think that's really sort of important for what's happening here, and I probably should have done a better job of not trying to contrast them so much. And we see gifts from the nobility, a very small number, but in a time when so many of the aristocracy in England are pushing away dissent, keeping dissent at arm's length, to see that commitment by a few, I think is quite important and speaks both to their sort of what they think they can do, the support they can give to dissent. Ministry, not surprising that a third of the books are coming from ministers, many of them, though, young. Many of them who don't have many more financial resources than Doddridge does. His classmates are supporting him, and I think there's something that we can read in that about the sort of growth of dissent for the next generation. But even more excitingly, the laity. 40% of the donations are coming from people in the pews, and they're giving recent books. It's the ministers who are giving the older texts. It's the laity who are giving the most recent stuff. And they're giving practical divinity. They're giving books that they're reading themselves. But they're also giving books on the fringes, of traditional dissenting culture. So books of science and natural history. And then finally, Doddridge, incredibly smart man that he is, maybe we should do this today, makes all of his students give books. So we know that 8 out of 22 donations by students recorded. Doddridge expected anybody who came back their second year had sort of passed medal and should ante up and give their own guinea for the purchase of books. And, I think there's some interesting trends in there. And I think there's where we see Doddridge's guiding hand. I think Doddridge is saying, I think you donate this book. And you think about these young impressionable students, and they're like, oh, yeah, I'll give Calvin. That sounds great. When maybe they'd rather give, Swift or something else. So in conclusion, I think from his arrival at John Jennings Academy in 1719, through his opportunity to run his own academy in 1729, through his death in 1751, Doddridge really was immersed in a world of texts. Throughout his life, he made his home not in the metropole, not in London, but in the English Midlands, a few days' journey from London, which really, as we know, was the center for print production at this time. Regular trips kept him in touch. He knew the currents. He was going back and forth between London and the Midlands. But it's the social practices and the networks and institutions of dissent that provide him with access to the textual resources that he needs as a student, a tutor, a pastor, an author. Gifting, loaning, arranging purchases, and the circulation of manuscript publications all reinforce bonds of friendship and foster understandings of the obligations of reciprocity. Dissenting academies and the libraries they house became complex sites integral not only to ministerial training of a rising generation, but also, I think, and this is where the book will go, and we can talk more about that, the perpetuation of a distinct dissenting culture over time, especially with the ups and downs, for anybody who studied dissent, of their political status. Networks knit together dissenters in a range of places, both in the metropole but also far beyond it, and become nodes for dissent in a web that's stretched to include those scattered across the kingdom and eventually across the world. Thank you.
I suppose I have to introduce myself as well. I'm Stephen Morello in Wabash College. I'd like to thank Jim Conley for inviting me to another one of these conferences to comment on a fascinating set of papers. Thank him for the chance to read two really interesting and well-done papers. They raise for me a question that I've adopted as the title of my comments today. What is print culture? And I hope I don't irritate too many people with this, raising this question. James Raven has shown us the close connection between printing and commerce. Books were not the only print commodities, as he shows very convincingly, and book printing was supported by jobbing work. Jobbing work, in turn, greased the wheels of commerce more generally. Kyle Roberts has shown us, as he just explained, the connection between books and social networks. And books were not just print commodities. Books were bought and sold, but also lent, gifted, copied, talked about, and taught from. And books are therefore an element in developing and maintaining social networks that were oral and manuscript-based as well as print-based. So this raises my question, what is print culture? Is it an independent category that we can analyze coherently? Never mind the question of how that culture differs between metropoles and the world beyond the metropoles. And a secondary question along those lines, given this session's title, which is the development of print culture in early modern Europe, what is early modern about early modern print culture? Is there continuity into the next period? This will lead me to an argument about historical periodization that I'll get to in a few minutes. So my approach here is to use James and Kyle's work to raise broad world historical questions of content for the rest of the for the rest of the conference. That is, I'm not criticizing or correcting either very fine paper. I'm just attempting to draw out some of the broader implications of each. And I do this as a world historian, as an author of a forthcoming world history text with Oxford, speaking of print and commerce and social networks. And I hope my approach provides some food for thought. So, print culture. To start with, neither James nor Kyle talk centrally about the ideas in books, especially books as containers of ideas. Professor Raven's article talks about print as an aspect and amplifier of commercial culture. And although Kyle does talk about content as markers and carriers of other social cultural information, this is not unique to printed works. So what cultures are we talking about? I think in Professor Raven's paper, we're talking about commercial culture and print as part of a wider commercial culture. It thus reflects, perhaps helps create, one set of cultural values, especially in Britain, but a set of cultural values that are common across Northwest European societies more generally in this period. A brief list of some of those values. Contracts as mediators of social relationships. I think this is fairly central to the Northwestern European civilization. Commerce and merchant activity as central and mediated by contracts as among those social relationships. And we can see many of the job work pieces, stuff that Professor Raven talks about, order forms, ledgers, receipts, as a sort of manual on how to run a business, pre-provided to small businesses outside centers of commerce. We see here the intersection of states and commerce and contracts in the sorts of joint stock companies, among others, that are using this material. And ultimately, therefore, what we see is a culture of capitalism at work. Now, in global terms, what this means is that we're seeing the sorts of values that arose from global network activity everywhere, especially networks of trade, but whose prominence in the set of European cultural values is, I will claim as a world historian, somewhat exceptional and not print-based. It predates print. So to illustrate this, I'll contrast for a moment the sorts of, I think there are two sorts of structures operating in world history. One is networks, the other is the hierarchies, the states and chiefdoms and empires and so forth that societies are divided into. And I'll contrast the hierarchy values in the history of Chinese print. Block printing was, of course, a Chinese invention in the time of the Tang Dynasty. It really expanded under the subsequent Song Dynasty. It was connected there with the Song Commercial Revolution, but it embodied a very different set of core values. The major thing printed in early Chinese print is the Confucian Classics, the whole canon of Confucian works. In the Song period, this increased availability of Confucian classics led in part to a new Neo-Confucian synthesis among Chinese elites that produced what we think of as Confucianism these days. It's really a sort of synthesis of Confucianism with a combination answer to and adoption of Buddhist metaphysics. But the other effect of print culture, of print production in China, was that it democratized, to some extent, access to those very texts. That led to an expansion of access to the exam system and the meritocracy that staffed the Chinese government. And that was focused, therefore, that meritocracy was focused on the central role of the state and bureaucratic Confucian status as the key mediator of social relationships, as by contrast with contracts in Europe. Therefore, what print did what the expansion of printed material did in China was reinforce the very much less exceptional dominance of hierarchy values in China as opposed to network values. These hierarchy values were also not print-based. They had predated print as well. It simply reinforced them. Both networks and hierarchies long predate print. So my conclusion from this little comparison, just a sample, is a pretty standard anti-technological determinist conclusion that the impact of a new technology depends pretty crucially upon the context into which it is introduced. And that's a conclusion visible in the histories of other technologies of this period, not just print, but particularly from my scholarly interest, gunpowder, which produces some very different results depending on the social, political, and economic context into which it's introduced. So again, the question, what exactly is print culture? We might see print not as part of commercial culture, but as part of a larger information culture or information societies. And here we can compare the role of print to other technologies of information storage and transport. It's closely allied, of course, to writing, and we've seen in both of these papers the overlap, the interweaving of print and written culture and questions of authority. And at the introduction of print and of writing, in fact, writing overlapped with oral authority. So writing is one of those prior technologies that makes print possible. We can also compare print to money, which is in fact simply a condensed and transportable form of information. And print exists within a broad Eurasian culture of paper, another Chinese invention. One of the things I tell my students in my world history classes is, pick whatever topic you want. The Chinese did it first. This is, for instance, brought out by a recent book by Lothar Müller called Weiße Magie, or White Magic, which talks about the spread of paper and the sorts of cultural possibilities that opened up. And therefore print can be seen as only an aspect of paper culture in information technology terms. All of these technologies condense information, make it durable and portable, and contribute to the offloading of memory from human brains into some external storage, which is one of the sort of long-term stories of human history in world historical terms. Someone has calculated, some evolutionary biologist has calculated that on an individual basis, humans were at their smartest about 10,000 years ago. And we've individually declined a bit since then. But of course, we know vastly more collectively because we have these sorts of information storage technologies. Another sort of culture that print participates in is, as Kyle Roberts pointed out, religious community culture. Here the content of books matters more, but in many ways is not the focus. We can see this by asking, what's the function of culture? And we can name at least two. For human communities, culture makes meaning, it makes the cosmos comprehensible, and culture creates identity. It creates cultural communities. In terms of meaning, here's where content mattered most. Books were one of the set of tools for understanding the cosmos and for conveying that understanding to new generations. Doddridge's library illustrates the many sources of meaning, of understanding the cosmos available to the dissenting community, and more broadly to the many communities that made up English society and the societies of Northwest Europe in the 18th century. But books were only part of a toolkit that included instruction and preaching, both of which are essentially oral, or that included, in the case of students hand copying texts, which Kyle also mentions, a significant element of scribal culture. And in terms of creating community, which is the real focus of Kyle's paper, books were even less central as books, that is, as content-filled containers, and they were simply one means, if an important one, of creating ties of community and identity among English dissenters. It can be said that as objects exchanged in various ways across the networks that connected and created dissenting communities, books were special in carrying ideas. But in fact, objects of trade always came with ideas attached. Chinese silks traded to steppe tribal leaders carried with them ideas about hierarchy, sumptuary display, and so forth. Books just made the ideas a bit more explicit. And even more, as Kyle's paper shows, the networks themselves were hardly products of printed material. They emerged from personal travel and conversation, from the personal relationships of teachers and students, and of brotherhoods of ministers, and through the manuscript culture of letter writing. So what do these case studies of printed material as aspects of commercial and religious networks of exchange or of information cultures tell us about print itself as a constituting element of culture? And I'll leave that question open, but suggest one possibility is that print does perhaps acts as an amplifier of other cultural ideas, of trends and values. And this raises my second question about periodization. Periodization and continuity, or not. First, I'll admit some broad periodization in the history of communication technologies and cultures. We can broadly divide this up into oral cultures, scribal cultures, print with a question mark, since that's the question I'm raising, and then finally what I've termed electronic cultures, although I'm really talking about mechanical and electronic reproduction via phonograph and then movies and things like that. What are the characteristics of these stages of communication technology and culture? Well, let's relate this first to communication and hierarchy. Purely oral societies generally have relatively low hierarchy and relatively unified cultures. Everybody operates through the same system of culture. Once you introduce writing, which is what I've lumped under scribal culture, writing is associated with high levels of hierarchy. The invention of writing coincides with the emergence of state-level societies in almost all parts of the world. And reading and writing were specialized and expensive skills. And so there's an implied hierarchy there. But the real hierarchy that's introduced once you have writing is the fundamental difference in the permanence of cultural products. Oral culture has a continuity, has a sort of collective permanence, but the individual products of oral culture, speeches, songs sung in a particular moment, are ephemeral, whereas written culture is permanent. And that introduces what I call a great cultural divide between elite culture and popular culture, which remains in most parts of the world oral, with a thin veneer of scribal culture laid on top of it for millennia. Print, when it's introduced, does not erase the great cultural divide. It might move it somewhat down the socio-political pyramid, and we can note the increased levels of literacy that both of our authors have pointed to in their papers. But it's still there because the permanent and impermanent divide is still there. So is print an amplifier? Oh, yeah, but it's not such an amplifier that it fundamentally changes cultural patterns, at least in this account. Electronic media, on the other hand, comes of age in an age of reduced or at least some more socially fluid hierarchy. But the key is that electronic media from phonographs on erase that permanent, impermanent distinction. You can now record someone's presentation. Electronic media, as we know, is far more reliable than, no, never mind. But it does erase that permanent, impermanent divide, and I think erases the great cultural divide. There is no longer a coherent distinction between high and popular culture, except ones that are invented in culture for the purposes of particular cultural inventors. So in each age, communication technology is both a reflection and a shaper of broader cultural patterns. And in this succession of communication technologies, there's overlaps of modes. No society, except a purely oral one, relies only on one mode. And we note, again, the manuscript copying in Kyle's paper and the oral, personal, and letter-writing connections of Doddridge's networks, as well as the combination of print and handwriting that occurs in many of the jobbing works that Professor Raven talked about. So the division, the other thing that happens here then if we talk about print culture is I think we've elided an important division. Is print really one era? And here I'll point to the another aspect of both of these papers. Both Professor Raven and Professor Roberts point to the limitations of print culture in the era that they're talking about, the pre-industrial world of low productivity and slow communications. And I will claim industrialization as the great divide, as the third of the three world historical revolutions, the second being the agricultural revolution and the first being the cognitive linguistic revolution that created modern human minds. So industrialization is the great divide, or as Ken Pomerantz might say, the great divergence. And I would claim 1500 to 1800 not as early modern, but not as an early modern world, but as a late agrarian one. Industrial print and industrial economy are, I think, a different era. We have print powered with powered machinery, which escapes the limits of muscle power and the 250 sheet per hour limit that Professor Raven notes on hand-driven printing presses. We get print in a world of mass production and mass consumption. We get mass population growth, dwarfing the growth of the 18th century. And here we can compare the beginning of the 18th century. English population is about 5 million, as Professor Raven, I believe, pointed out. By the end of the 18th century, it's between 6 and 8 million. And before we go on from there, remember that England had about 5 million people in 1340. Of course, it had about 3 million people 10 years later, because in 1348, a third of the population died. And it took a long time to recover. So we're really looking at a much longer term, nearly flat population curve until you get to 1800. So if we take the high end, 8 million people in England in 1800, and this is according to the English census, in the 1900 census there are 30 million and 53 million today. So all of this feeds into network connections that are made far more powerful and pervasive by new technologies of transportation. We're no longer limited to people walking around the countryside, riding horses to create their social networks. Steamships replace sail. So the technologies which inevitably transformed the relationship between metropoles and peripheries are there. And if we say that that's only a change in quantity, I think it's such a change in quantity as to be a qualitative change. So if all this is true, I'm claiming it is, it raises my second key question. Is late agrarian print culture, or in more conventional terms, early modern print culture, really the same thing as early industrial or 19th century print culture? And that's assuming there's such a thing as print culture in the first place. See question 1. And never mind the culture of print once mechanical and electronic reproduction of oral ephemeral cultural products was added as a layer from the 19th century on. Thank you.
Could I respond first of all by saying thank you very much. I thought that was extremely stimulating, and I agree with almost every word of what you said. I agree with the importance of the question, and I was thinking back also. I mean, I've been ever since the word book history was invented, I've been a skeptic of the idea of book history, and people around here probably heard me on various occasions sort of denouncing this as a rather easy label, and it's the same with print culture. I think print culture is a very easy label to use, and I was wondering whether I'd actually ever used it myself to describe what one was doing, because I absolutely agree with what you're saying. and incidentally, I think also in terms of technology, and one thing that I think is extremely important. I mean, there is a danger with an easy use of print culture and so forth to assume what I think I said is a sort of linear development, and not to think about constraints and checks and balances and comparative technologies as well. I think it's very exciting what's happening at the moment in terms of exploration of the impact of printing in East and West. I'm working with a book with Peter Burke and Cindy Brokow and Joe McDermott in comparing movable type and xylography and so forth in East and West. And one of the things which I started as a very radical position, having seen what one could do with the woodblock printing and the fine work and erasure, and thinking, well, actually, the introduction of movable type and movable type and so forth in the printing house in the 15th and 16th century was actually a very inefficient process. And you have to think about, all that composing and recomposing and breaking down and so forth, given that, and looking comparatively again at the Japanese introduction of movable type and then the abandonment of that for xylography during the 19th century is a very, very interesting, I think, check to our thoughts and assumptions about the impact of movable type and looking different. So I think that there are many fascinating, very interesting variables here about comparative technologies, and absolutely agree with you in terms of looking at the context in which technology is introduced. And actually Ken Pomerantz and probably know Patrick O'Brien's big project in London. We had a big meeting 2 weeks ago when, again, it was a sort of East meets West, and there were also fascinating ideas also about this interaction between printing and orality in various ways, and where authority lies and so forth. So I think what you said was extremely stimulating. Where I'd want to press it a little bit, I think, is that you said an amplifier. I think also an enabler. And I wonder the extent to which one can think about the extent to which printing is a transformative a transformative mode or transformative which actually alters practices and behaviours. So that if you're actually thinking about, quite apart from the and notice, interesting, I don't think you used the word knowledge, which I found interesting. You talked about information, and quite apart from the idea of books and knowledge and the containment of knowledge and information and so forth, if I just restrict for a moment a couple of thoughts just on the sorts of materials that I'm sort of rather interested in terms of non-book printing, this transformative process in terms of the enabling of new structures of thought and of new transactions between individuals, which yes, can compound ideas of hierarchy, but I think also networks in a complicated and complex way. So that if you look at the role of printing in 17th century Western Europe, 18th century Western Europe, you see this avalanche of different printed forms, literary forms, which secure different modes of employment, of the regularity of timekeeping, of different social practices from marriage to death to all sorts of things, a different way of thinking and a different way of a construction of social knowledge through printing, which I think is transformative. So yes, an amplifier of something there, but I think an enabler and something which is actually transforming social practices in different ways. But I'll leave it at that, but I thought that was very, very, very provocative and interesting.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the great comments. Maybe the two things I would say, and I won't speak too long, is one about your sort of very good point that we're not necessarily talking about the content of the printed, or the textual materials, but all of the, in many ways, the cultural ramifications of it. And for me, I think that came as a very young scholar, and having somebody as wonderful as Bob Gross point out that I kept using this word print culture, but what I was really talking about was a printed book. I wasn't thinking in many ways about everything else that went into that. And in fact, there is a distinct sort of if we use Darnton or the modifications of Darnton as a way of understanding that. I think the other thing that's really fascinating, I mean, it's your final question is a great one for this conference, and I don't feel comfortable necessarily speaking for the industrial age. I'm going to stick in the 18th century. But I think maybe one of the things that we do, one of the things that we add to that is that with each of these different technologies, right, thinking about orality as a technology, thinking about scribal publication as an orality, sort of more traditional printing versus industrial printing, is the ways in which we remain open to the ways that cultures attach different meanings to each of those forms. That, eschewing any sort of technological determinism, which you wouldn't want to put in there, right, the way in which what is appropriate to appear in what form. After Doddridge dies, there's a real rush to try to get a lot of his stuff into print. He dies much younger than anybody expects. So they finish the Family Expositor, but he has these lectures on preaching. And these lectures on preaching are very candid. And Doddridge lets me know what he thinks of many of the great preachers of the 18th century. Getting access to this text is something that many dissenters want, right? This is the sort of holy grail of inside information on who was great and who wasn't, in Doddridge's opinion. So it's kept out of print. When Bristol Baptist reopens its library in the 1770s, they pay for a scribal copy to be made. They pay for a manuscript copy to be made. They could fully have published this, but they didn't, right? So the way in which that text was not going to be safe for industrialized or more commercialized consumption until later on. And I think we see that in a lot of the wonderful papers for today, right? That there are things that need to remain in manuscript. There are things that are better oral. So in some ways, maybe that might be a bit of a pushback, that we need to always remember that cultures are constructing meaning for things as well.
Yes, no, I agree completely. I take your point also about being hesitant about moving into the 19th century and industrialization. I'm originally a medievalist, so I view that as like, after 1800, foreign territory. But I mean, that simply points out how clear the break is, that the transformation at that point. And I agree that enabler that's a nice word. I didn't mean to exclude. I suggested amplifier as one of a number of possible answers, leaving the question open for the audience. I think enabler is right. I think the distinction I really meant to draw is exactly that what it was enabling was network activity, and in some ways less constrained, or the dominance of network, not activity but values within European culture, is what that enabled, promoted, amplified, and that's part, for me, of a very complicated answer to why the Industrial Revolution happened where it did and not elsewhere. So, but that's clearly a question beyond the scope of that's the next conference, right? So, I think at this point we should probably open it to questions from the audience and comments.
Well, as someone who works mostly in the late 19th and early 20th century, I'd just be careful of drawing too sharp a break with the Industrial Revolution. There are oral practices that continue. There are scribal practices that continue.
Oh, yeah.
And to what Kyle said about cultures attaching different meanings to different forms, of course, they attach multiply different meanings to different forms at the same time.
Yeah.
So perhaps this is just my kind of congenital aversion to clean lines. I just wanted to say that. I also wondered, Stephen, if you could clarify what you meant by hierarchy.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. This is a term I use in my textbook. I create a model of world history, and I think networks is fairly obvious. Hierarchies is simply my word to agglomerate states, chiefdoms, empires. It's the hierarchical organization of individual societies, as opposed to the horizontal connections between societies represented by networks. So it's a catch-all term for any form of from small tribes up through vast imperial organizations.
Implying differences in status?
Implying differences in status, which are different across different forms of hierarchy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'd like to follow up with something that Stephen said that tied in my mind both the papers, and that was when he talked about the Chinese invention of paper. Well, someone said that the Chinese also invented paperwork.
Yeah.
And maybe what we're seeing here is the growth of bureaucracy and institutionalization moving from the agrarian society into the industrial society of the 19th century. And print technology is what enables that institutionalization. And Kyle's paper, of course, was an example of the growing number of commercial and non-commercial institutions in the 18th century that we see proliferating in the 19th century. And what institutionalization and bureaucratization does through print technology is it enables standardization and translocality, so that we see a kind of sort of blending or the movement of cultures from local areas out and creating these networks through bureaucracies and institutions. And I wondered if other people have comments on that.
Within the world of dissenting academies, I mean, that's absolutely the case. Doddridge's lectures on divinity are printed in 1763 and become the standard textbook through the 19th century. Something as personal in many ways. I mean, dissent is a massive umbrella. I mean, dissent includes many different flavors all along the theological spectrum. So standardization is quite odd in many ways, because why would a Baptist want to use what a Presbyterian would use, who becomes a Unitarian? So, but there is something in that process that because you can do that, and because, and I wonder how far you can read it, right, in as a gauge of dissent's own confidence in itself, that by the 19th century, dissent becomes increasingly reliant on its 18th century forefathers, and less so, perhaps, on its own contemporary academics. But absolutely, and that can get shipped. You can use that in Brown University, in Boston, in Rhode Island. You can use it if you can send it to Serampore.
And one contemporary measure of that is the perception at the time that standardization is going on, and dissenting voices who say, hold on, we don't want this, and everything from accusations of literary devaluation from mass production of literature with a capital L at the end of the 18th century to early 19th century, and what is it, to concerns about what we now call the Big Brother or the information society in various ways, and voices against that from the 1780s and 90s onwards, which is complex, because I think it's also linked to political change and reaction to revolution as well. But
and I think your central point about mass production and the abstraction of personal authority into really vast bureaucracies is true across a lot of forms of authority, not just bureaucracy.
Could I just pick up on that, because it does come back to a point about your periodization in terms of the kind of capture of all performance. Of course, what Cal's talking about here in the printing of Doddridge's lectures is the capture of oral performance. And of course, a vast amount of the industrial print of the 19th century is oral performance captured, an extraordinary amount, both in terms of newspapers and what they're producing, and in terms of periodicals and book production, an enormous amount.
Sheet music.
Yeah, and I suppose it goes back to one of the things that Joan was saying about the way in which we've got to be careful about the way in which we try and slide apart these things which are not only lying across each other but actually kind of deeply enmeshed.
And I think my point was that the communication technologies and those sorts of things are always overlapped and layered, and that continues right through. Mine is more about the larger context.
But it's
agrarian versus industrial. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. It's captured in a particular way, though, going back to appropriateness or the mode or whatever. And one I think aspect of that is looking at my forms, constantly looking at these different sort of forms that now survive in record offices up and down, whatever. The way that they are, what's the word? Abrogated, I don't know what, the use of the form is not actually as was intended. So the capture of what was oral, suddenly you have to, and you can think about that. I mean, I thought about it actually in one of the many airports I was in yesterday. I don't ask me which one, but it said go to gate something, or okay, and it was, gate 84, this must have been in Houston. And when I got to gate 84, it had been subdivided into 84 A, B, C, D, E, whereas gate 81 to 83 didn't seem to exist or was redundant or something, and I suddenly thought of my forms in which insufficient space had been left for question 3, and they're all scribbling, trying to put it in there, and question 4 was completely redundant, there was space, and I turned over, and so there's an extent to which the capture of what was oral and thought to be important and is then translated into the printed form doesn't quite fit. So it's a question of fit and different, anyway. I just want to add a little other point about translocal or transnational as well, when it's in different languages as well. We haven't talked about the vernacular or a medium, and I've just been doing something interesting about Latin, and Neo-Latinity is an interesting language form. But you could say the same with French. And one of the interesting forms that develops from the stuff that I'm doing in the late 18th century is again, for political reasons, forms about aliens, and a requirement for every alien to fill in a form in the 1790s, and huge interest in having somebody employed to translate from the French particularly to the English and so forth. And again, it doesn't fit the form, and the whole thing's a complete mess, and it's fascinating. I mean, it would be a subject in its own right to think about the modality of print and the oral, and how and it is, I think it is transformative as well in respects.
Maybe just, if I could.
Just, go ahead.
I was actually going to, and then Chris can respond. I was thinking about a paper that Chris gave, and the way in which those captures of oral performance also in being printed, though, we think about standardization, but the use of them, right, the way in which these things are used then works against that standardization. If you have a hymn book and it doesn't have the noted music but just gives you a possible tune, and Chris gave a paper in Edinburgh and a panel that I was on where he was talking about lining out. Well, if you don't know how to line it out and you line it out in a different way, the ways in which these oral performances then get remade, and the way we have to find those little moments where we see, in fact, that there isn't that much of
I wanted to make a comment to follow on Christine's point and then ask you a question, Kyle. I was really struck in reading James's paper how much libraries, the rise of libraries, are really underwritten, to risk a pun, by these job printed, that you have these blank ledgers, labels, these kinds of, that allow you to start standardize it so that even when you're years before any kind of Dewey Decimal System or something, that you still have this way to record, here are the 100 some odd, it was in some of these slides, here are the 100 some odd volumes that we have in this library. Here's how we can keep track of them, here's when they came in, here's who gave them, all those kinds of things. And the database is in some ways remediating that job printing at some level. Even as dynamic as we tend to think of databases as being, you still have to have them work like that blank ledger on the ground floor to get the stuff into them. So that's something that I suspect will keep coming up as we get further through the conference. But Kyle, what I wanted to ask you is actually about some geographical issues, because as you're talking about the Midlands and the kind of networks that are forming here, forming with London and all this, as an early Americanist, I mean, of course, how is this transatlantic world of dissent forming, and how much the kinds of experiences that Doddridge has are being replicated in North America compared to how more, I don't know if we want to call them colonial practices, but just something different is being done in North America. And just thinking especially about Watts and Doddridge having so many North American correspondents, and even Watts gives one of the first major gifts to Yale's library, and it's a full set of his published works. So yeah, how that kind of, we're seeding the new world, but at the same time they're also helping to print the new stuff that's coming out of New England in particular. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit on how the colonies feature in all this.
Oh yeah, no, I think they're sort of hugely important. I think Frank Lambert's work in publishing early Jonathan Edwards publications, that A Faithful Narrative is a London publication. It's not not printed in Northampton, Massachusetts. And I quite love that Doddridge is in Northampton, England, and Edwards is in Northampton, Massachusetts, and they are in fact equally influential figures. Doddridge's correspondence is huge. There's 360 plus different correspondence, several thousand letters that have survived. When I get that next grant, anybody who has grant money to give out, take it. Using something like Stanford's Republic of Letters technologies to start mapping those connections, I think is hugely important. The second chapter wants to look at Harvard College Library, which burns down when Halls Hall burns down. The nucleus of that library is a single gift. from a London dissenter, Thomas Hollis. And that is a library full of small R Republican books. And it's quite wonderful. Hollis doesn't really give a lot. He's London-based, a Baptist. He doesn't give a lot to English institutions as they're growing. But Harvard is going to get this massive collection. And that will be really the site where I can interrogate not just the connections that I think we already know about, the way in which the sort of provincial provincial crises of North Americans and their desire to keep those contacts with London, but also in a way that the New World itself, which by 1760 is not really all that new anymore, is going to be fortuitously given this collection of works that perhaps we could argue were too radical to be given to an English institution. What's going on there? What does Hollis think that he's doing? And the timing's nice. Harvard was happy to get it. They didn't have a library anymore. So absolutely great questions. But the other part of that is not just the Atlantic, but the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, right? Mm-hmm. Bristol Baptist College is a repository for everything that William Carey publishes. And lots of Baptist ministers are trained in Bristol. Bristol making a lot of money off the slave trade. Bristol in a very complicated economic relationship with the larger world, is in many ways creating the next generation of missionaries that go off to work with Carey. And Carey's work is textual, right? So I think there's a lot more we need to know there.
This is a comment rather than a question, but to come back to what James was saying, what you just said, Kyle, about these intersections between orality and print and the ways in which they do and do not fit. I'm glad you mentioned the Pacific, because you see it at its most intense, of course, when an indigenous oral culture hits a colonising print culture. And there's a marvellous anecdote about New Zealand when the Bible was first translated, the New Testament was first translated and circulated amongst Maori. The practice was for one person to become literate enough to then go back to their village and read it to the rest of the people they related to, who then learned it by heart. So the first version of the New Testament was basically learned by heart. And about 30 years later, there was a new translation of the New Testament done, which was more correct in its translation of Maori into print. But these were Maori language versions. But Maori refused to accept it, because once they had converted the original print text into an oral text that they knew by heart, they wouldn't agree that that authority could be superseded by something that was more correct. So it shows you something very interesting, I think.
Yeah. I just wanted to go back to the conceptual question of print culture and silk and print, which I think was an interesting way to start. And I wonder if we don't tie ourselves up into knots trying to make the distinction between print and silk. And in a way, print and silk both can establish network relations and sociality. And it seems to me not altogether necessary to distinguish between the two. The trouble term perhaps is culture, in the sense that culture, at least in the anthropological sense, of a whole, integrated, continuous way of being, is the thing that print often seems to move over or across. The print networks that we've been discussing are ones that don't necessarily associate with particular cultures, so that you can be an adult and read kids' fiction, or you can be in rural Rochester, New York, and be part of the metropole at the same time. So the print seems to move, and it's not necessarily related to the culture. Network seems a little bit of a more nimble term. There was, however, one word that hasn't come up yet, and which seems precise to this moment, and which seems somewhat linked to print, and that's public. Print publics, both in the Habermasian sense, but also more particularly as particular modes of address to strangers with reflexivity, as a particular kind of print network. If not a culture. So I was just I'm just interested in this way that it does seem to me that a public, you don't really have a silk public as much as you have a print public. But
well, I'm not going to try and tackle that entire question, I think. But Stuart Gordon gave a paper at one of these conferences a few years ago that was a fascinating sort of examination of an entire network, a roving culture that transcended much of East and South Asia. That networks were created by the gifts of robes that conveyed status and so forth, and that transcended any sort of local cultural divisions and said things to people, I think, in much the same way that you're describing print doing. And I suppose one of the things I should point about by my conception of networks and hierarchies is that those two structures are in a tense relationship. They have very different sorts of values inherently, so when they intersect, there's tension there that needs to be mediated culturally. Can I say that? Yeah, I mean, I take your point that culture is itself a slippery or a complicated term.
The print public also might have a very specific form of sort of temporality in a way that if that makes sense, in the sense that if we think in terms of the production of these containers of knowledge and thought, that there is, in the way in which they are used and received, a very specific idea of currency or not. I mean, I make this point often, so forgive me if anyone's heard me say it before, but in terms of having worked for a long while with the having seen for so long the importance of the latest and the a la mode fashionable sort of literature which so many people wanted to collect as individual collectors or in libraries through the 18th century, I was then taken aback by work, particularly in libraries scattered across the place, who were wanting to get involved in political debates of the moment, who then expected to be able to receive antiquarian books or antiquarian print going back quite some time, and there was a different sense of what was current and literary currency. So the idea that of there being a public is one which also transcends that moment and goes back into for something. So it's crossing time as well as space.
Wants to pick up your idea, Stephen, of amplifiers and James's of enablers. And to think, I was very fascinated, as I think everybody was, by those diagrams that you showed of London and where those booksellers, where those printers were, where the book binders, and that they were all close together. And that makes sense in the context of London. But if we're thinking about it as in terms of print culture beyond the metropolis, what do you feel we should say about the role of the stationers as a company which really tried to protect its own and for a long time seems to have conceded the fact that the printing should be in London rather than extended beyond that? And it's the 18th century, obviously, where you suddenly get this explosion of so many places across England where you have centres of printing.
Well,
so it's really to ask you about the role of the stationers.
Yes, I mean, a rather crude headline would be, I suppose, that the stationers screw up in the 1680s. If you look at this, one can look at the lapse of the licensing laws, the lapse of the Printing Acts in 1695 as a sort of landmark, and there has been the sort of Macaulay line, quite some time, that this is the beginnings of a liberty of the press because of the end of regulation and so forth, and general concession that should be discounted because it is, after all, the lapse, not the abolition of these acts. And the lapse of them, which allows printing once again outside the four towns, from 1662 to 1695, in which you can only print in Cambridge, Oxford, London and York, but most of it takes place in London, confirms and reconfirms the control of the stationers' company, and with the added thing of a licenser, added Roger Lestrange and a licenser for the first time during that period as well, as a sort of additional sort of form of state censorship. But what really happens, I think at the heart of it really is the extent to which the stationers' company become greedy. There's internecine warfare within the stationers' company in the 1680s, and that the structure sort of cannot really continue to hold. And so with the lapse and these quite brave souls, I think, going out to print, Bonny in Exeter, Bristol, all these other places, setting up printing presses for the first time, developing a newspaper. I think by the 1720s it becomes clear that the licensing laws are not going to be reimposed. And you have the development of a new type of structure of networks in which, for economic reasons, sort of monopolistic reasons, the sort of cartelisation of the London trade means that London is going to maintain its economic, it's going to continue as a centre for book production and so forth, but which sees the value. I think the London books are members of the Stationers' Company, the great London publishing booksellers, see the value of this network that has actually been produced, and so you get the development of a different type of structure in which these printers out there in the provinces, reliant largely for income on their newspaper and their jobbing printing, act as agents. So there's a symbiotic relationship as agents of London booksellers, in which the newspaper and other sort of advertisements as well, sometimes separate advertisements, becomes a mean for individuals in the country to gain access to print, which is primarily London produced, but which is now accessible regionally. So, sorry, it's a long sort of answer, but I think that there's a key period. The key is from the 1680s to sort of 1700.
Real quickly, I think all three of you can comment on this. To what extent do you consider the manufacturers, the technologists who manufacture printing equipment, participants in print culture? And secondly, purely content question, was all of this that was used made in Britain, or was some of it imported from this equipment? Was it transported or imported from the continent? Because that adds a dimension to the story that, maybe we haven't heard, unless it's in your paper.
Paper is the one of the, we have imported paper for Britain mostly, in terms of the quality that's required, up to the 1720s, home production thereafter a bit. Interesting work though going on at the moment. Heather Wolfe, whom I was with recently in New Zealand, but fascinating lecture she gave there about, she's convinced actually that we underestimate the quality of paper and the cheapness of paper in the 16th and 17th century. So perhaps what I'm saying is a bit old hat. Some technological things seems introduced, but I think that's a general question. What came out of the going back to when a conference recently brought together Ken Pomerantz and Patrick O'Brien and all sorts of people from East and West who were trying to sort of look at these questions. An interesting thing that came out of it was the extent to which we were trying to think about broad conceptual issues. Some of the arguments that we've had here, or fascinating discussion about networks or hierarchies. There were broad conceptual issues being discussed there. But when we actually came down to it and we had individual contributions, so much hinged on small technological points. How was ink made? What did ink do? Mm-hmm. Did ink set? What were drying times like on sheets? Variable drying times in different climates. The quality of the paper. Did it dry? How was the impression made? How did people in wood carving do these? Make the erasures? How long could wood blocks keep? Small points. And so much hinged on these, and we were sort of thinking, well, these are almost antiquarian minutiae technological points, but they made a huge difference to the broad concept that we talked about.
And my own answer to that would be less broad, but a particular point. I'm not sure if I call it a technology, but typefaces, fonts, were initially imported and came from handwriting models, misunderstood Carolingian minuscule is the basis of Roman fonts, and that's an Italian invention, but then gets sort of adopted and adapted everywhere, Caslon and Baskerville being the great English examples of these developments.
My impression, I guess, thinking would be that there was extensive hyper competition between the manufacturers of printing equipment, and to the extent that these advances and modernizations were being made, that influenced output, that influenced quality, all of this. Just a question. Thank you.
One more question? If not, I'll make one final comment about this connection between print and orality and so forth, that both writing and print can affect the forms of orality. This is actually some of the work that Professor Miles, my wife, has done on the introduction of print in early modern German context, and that the spread of literacy affected the syntax of German. And this is actually repeats something that happened to ancient Akkadian. This is something studied by Guy Deutscher, that you introduce writing and syntax becomes more complicated. Spoken syntax apparently becomes more complicated. It's harder to prove with Akkadian, but it's certainly clear with early New High German. So.
And could I add a small anecdote to Lydia's point, because I thought that was fascinating what you were saying about orality in print. When I was doing work on the Bray libraries, the libraries that Thomas Bray wanted to set up as a missionary with SPCK and the SPG, I looked at letters in the Lambeth Palace Library that were coming back from missionaries in North Carolina sent by Thomas Bray, and there I expected, what I wanted to hook up was how what the missionaries, the Bibles and the prayer books that they were getting from SPCK. And some of the letters there coming back actually were sent to Bray Associates in the 1720s and 1730s, and they basically said, for heaven's sake, don't send us any more Bibles. Don't send us any more Bibles or prayer books. We're sitting on boxes of them. And one of the letters actually says, I can't remember the exact quote, but it basically says, do not send us any more print, which is rather interesting.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks everyone for the questions.